A queen traded her crown for a wash basin, personally tending to lepers in the monastery she built. One visionary saint, who conversed with the living light, invented her own secret alphabet and composed haunting music still performed today. A young girl, ordered into a brothel for her faith, became so heavy that a team of oxen couldn't drag her across the threshold. Another holy woman was said to be lifted into the air by angels 7 times a day for prayer, nourished only by heavenly food for decades. Number 8. Saint Radegund, the queen who said nope to silts and yes to service. Radegund was born around 520 AD in Thuringia, which is part of modern-day Germany. She wasn't just anyone. She was a princess. But her early life was far from a fairy tale. When she was just a young girl, the Franks, led by King Clothar I and his brother, invaded her homeland. Her family was torn apart by violence, and Radegund herself was taken captive. She became part of the spoils of war, a princess reduced to a prize. Clothar I, of the sons of the famous King Clovis, decided he wanted Radegund for himself. Despite her youth and her captivity, she was given an education which was unusual for many women at the time, even royal ones. She learned to read and write, and she developed a deep interest in religious texts. She was beautiful and intelligent, but her heart wasn't set on royal life. She longed for a life dedicated to God. Around 540, Clothar forced her to marry him, making her one of his several wives. Life as a Frankish queen was filled with luxury, but for Radegund, it felt like a gilded cage. She dressed simply, ate little, and spent much of her time in prayer or helping the poor, much to the confusion of the Frankish court, who expected her to revel in her queenly status. The queenly duties were a burden. She often clashed with Clothar, who was known for his brutal and worldly ways. Radegund, on the other hand, was already living like a nun within the palace walls. She would rise in the night to pray, sometimes lying on a cold hair shirt on the floor instead of her royal bed. She established a hospital near the palace and would personally tend to the sick, including those with leprosy, washing their wounds and offering them comfort. This was shocking behavior for a queen who was expected to maintain distance and dignity. The breaking point came when Clothar ordered the murder of her younger brother. This act of cruelty was too much for Radegund to bear. She decided she could no longer stay with him. She fled the court, seeking sanctuary with Bishop Médard of Noyon. She begged him to consecrate her as a deaconess, effectively ending her marriage and dedicating her life to the church. At first, Bishop Médard hesitated. Consecrating a queen against the king's wishes was a dangerous move. But Radegund was resolute. She dramatically entered the sanctuary, took off her royal robes, laid them on the altar, and put on a religious habit. Faced with such determination, Bishop Médard relented and consecrated her. Radegund eventually made her way to Poitiers. There, she founded a monastery, the Abbey of the Holy Cross, around 558 AD. This wasn't just any monastery, it was a double monastery, housing both monks and nuns, though the nuns community was her primary focus. She didn't become the abbess herself, choosing instead a woman named Agnes for the role, while she lived as a simple nun. However, her influence was profound. She established a rule for the community, likely based on the teachings of Caesarius of Arles, which emphasized prayer, study, and manual labor. The nuns at Holy Cross were known for their literacy. They copied manuscripts and engaged in learning. Radegund herself was a patron of arts and letters. The poet Venantius Fortunatus became a close friend and spent much time at the monastery writing poems for and about Radegund and the community. He described her extreme asceticism, her fasting, her vigils, her wearing of coarse garments, and her tireless service to the poorest and sickest individuals she could find, whom she would bring into the monastery to care for. She even acquired a relic of the true cross for her abbey, a significant event that brought great prestige and spiritual focus to her foundation. Radegund's life showed a path of rejecting worldly power for spiritual devotion and active charity. She passed away on August 13, 587 AD, and her tomb in Poitiers quickly became a site of pilgrimage. Number 7. Saint Agnes of Rome, the girl who faced death and didn't even blink. Agnes of Rome was a young girl living in Rome around the turn of the 4th century, during a time when being a Christian could cost you your life. The Emperor Diocletian was in power, and his persecution of Christians was notoriously fierce. Agnes came from a noble Roman family, which meant she probably had a comfortable life and prospects of a good marriage. But Agnes had other plans. From a very young age, she decided she wanted to dedicate her life entirely to Jesus Christ, choosing him as her spiritual spouse. This meant she intended to remain a virgin. This decision put her on a collision course with the expectations of Roman society, and especially with powerful men. The story goes that the son of the prefect of Rome, a high-ranking official, wanted to marry her. He was smitten by her beauty and her family's status, but Agnes refused him flat out. She told him, and anyone else who would listen, that she was already promised to another, a spouse far greater and wealthier than any earthly suitor. When pressed, she revealed this spouse was Jesus Christ. This was not the answer the prefect's son or the prefect himself wanted to hear. Her refusal was seen not just as a personal slight, but as an affront to Roman gods and Roman authority, especially since she openly professed her Christian faith. Furious at her rejection and her steadfast Christianity, the prefect tried to force her to renounce her faith and worship Roman gods. He offered threats, then promises of riches and honor if she would just comply. Agnes stood firm. She was only about 12 or 13 years old, but she showed a courage that astounded her persecutors. The prefect, unable to break her will through words, resorted to more brutal tactics. He ordered her to be exposed in a public brothel, a truly horrific and humiliating punishment designed to shame her and break her spirit. According to the accounts, as she was dragged naked through the streets to the brothel, her hair miraculously grew to cover her entire body, like a veil protecting her modesty. When she arrived at the brothel, another miracle is said to have occurred. The men who attempted to approach her were either struck with a sudden blindness or filled with such awe and fear that they couldn't touch her. One account tells of the prefect's son himself attempting to violate her, only to be struck dead or seriously incapacitated by a divine force. Agnes then prayed for him, and he was restored to health, a miracle that reportedly led to some conversions, but further enraged the authorities. Frustrated by these events, the prefect ordered that Agnes be burned at the stake. She was taken to the place of execution, but when the fire was lit, the flames miraculously parted around her, refusing to touch her skin, while the executioners themselves were reportedly harmed by the heat. Seeing that fire would not kill her, the officer in charge ordered her to be executed by the sword. A soldier then beheaded her, or stabbed her in the throat, a common method of Roman execution. So, around 304 AD, Agnes died a martyr for her faith. Her parents buried her in a catacomb near Rome. Very quickly, her tomb became a place of veneration. Christians admired her unwavering faith, her purity, and her incredible courage at such a young age. Constantina, the daughter of Emperor Constantine, was said to have been cured of leprosy after praying at Agnes's tomb, and she later built a large basilica in Agnes's honor over the site. Medieval nuns would have heard these stories of a young girl who chose spiritual commitment over worldly marriage, who faced down powerful men, and whose purity was divinely protected. Her name Agnes is similar to the Latin word agnus, meaning lamb, and she was often depicted with a lamb, symbolizing her innocence and her role as a sacrificial offering. Number 6. Saint Scholastica, the twin sister who bent the weather to her will. Scholastica was born around 480 AD in Norcia, Italy. If that year and place sound familiar, it's because she had a very famous twin brother, Benedict of Nursia, the man widely considered the father of Western monasticism. From their earliest years, it's said that Scholastica, like her brother, was deeply drawn to a life of religious devotion. While Benedict went off to study in Rome and then to live as a hermit before founding his monastery at Monte Cassino, Scholastica also dedicated herself to God. She didn't follow Benedict into his mail. Only communities, of course. Instead, she is traditionally believed to have founded her own community for women. This community was located not far from Monte Cassino, at a place called Plumbariola, about 5 miles away. It was here that she established a convent, likely following a rule of life similar to the one her brother was developing for his monks, a life centered on prayer work, gora et labor, and communal living. She became the abbess of this community, guiding other women who wished to dedicate their lives to spiritual pursuits. The most famous story about Scholastica and Benedict comes from Saint Gregory the Great, who wrote about them in his dialogues about a century after their deaths. According to Gregory, Benedict and Scholastica had a tradition of meeting once a year. Since Scholastica was not permitted to enter Benedict's monastery, and he was not to stay overnight outside its walls, they would meet at a house located between their two communities. They would spend the day in prayer, spiritual conversation, and praising God. On their very last meeting, something remarkable happened. They had spent the whole day together, and as evening approached, Benedict prepared to leave and return to Monte Cassino. Scholastica, perhaps sensing it would be their final meeting on earth, begged him to stay the night so they could continue their holy conversation until morning. Benedict refused. He was adamant about adhering to the rules of his own monastery, which forbade him from spending a night away from it without a very serious reason. Scholastica was deeply disappointed. So, she did something extraordinary. She bowed her head, clasped her hands on the table, and began to pray silently. As she lifted her head, a sudden and violent storm erupted. Thunder crashed, lightning flashed, and rain poured down so heavily that it was impossible for Benedict and his accompanying monks to even think about leaving. Benedict was astonished and a bit annoyed. "May Almighty God forgive you, sister," he reportedly said. "What have you done?" Scholastica calmly replied, "I asked you, and you would not listen to me. So I asked my God, and he has listened to me. Now go off if you can. Leave me and go back to your monastery." Benedict, realizing he was outmaneuvered by his sister's powerful prayer, had no choice but to stay. They spent the entire night awake, engaged in deep spiritual discussion, finding solace and joy in each other's company. Medieval nuns listening to this story would hear about a woman whose prayer was so potent it could change the weather and even make the great Saint Benedict bend his own strict rules. Just 3 days after this meeting, Benedict was in his cell at Monte Cassino when he had a vision. He saw his sister's soul ascending to heaven in the form of a white dove. He understood immediately that she had died. He sent some of his monks to her convent to bring her body back to his monastery. He had her buried in the tomb he had prepared for himself. The idea was that, just as their souls had always been united in God, their bodies should not be separated in burial. Scholastica passed away around 543 AD. Her story highlighted the deep spiritual connection between siblings dedicated to God and the power of a woman's persistent prayer. Number 5. Saint Clare of Assisi. She ran away from home to live on literally nothing. Clare was born around 1194 in Assisi, Italy, into a wealthy and noble family, the Alfreducios. From a young age, she wasn't interested in the fancy clothes parties or marriage proposals that were typical for a girl of her status. Instead, she was drawn to prayer, acts of penance, like secretly wearing a rough hair shirt under her fine dresses, and giving alms to the poor. She heard about another young man from Assisi who had also turned his back on wealth and was preaching a radical new way of life, Francis Bernardone, who would become Saint Francis of Assisi. Clare was deeply moved by Francis's preaching about living a life of absolute poverty in imitation of Christ and the apostles. She felt a strong calling to follow this path. Her family, however, had other plans for her. They wanted her to marry a wealthy nobleman, which was the expected path. Clare knew she had to make a choice. On the night of Palm Sunday in 1212, when she was about 18 years old, Clare made a dramatic escape. She secretly left her family's lavish home, accompanied by her Aunt Bianca and another companion. She made her way through the dark streets to the little chapel of the Portiuncula, where Francis and his friars were waiting for her with lighted torches. In a deeply symbolic ceremony, Francis cut off Clare's long, beautiful hair, a sign of her renunciation of the world and her consecration to God. She exchanged her rich gown for a simple, rough woolen tunic, like the ones Francis and his followers wore. Initially, Francis placed her temporarily with some Benedictine nuns nearby, as there was no established community for women following his specific way of life yet. Her family was furious. They tried to forcibly drag her back home, but Clare clung to the altar, revealing her shorn head and declaring that she would have no other spouse but Christ. Her resolve was so strong that they eventually had to give up. Soon, other women, inspired by Clare's example, wanted to join her, including her own sister, Agnes. Francis helped them establish a small, poor dwelling next to the church of San Damiano, a church that Francis himself had rebuilt. This became the first community of what would later be known as the Poor Ladies of San Damiano, and eventually the Order of Poor Clares. Clare became the abbess, and she was determined that her community would live in radical poverty. This was a revolutionary idea. Most female monasteries at the time relied on endowments and property to support themselves. Clare, however, insisted on what she called the privilege of poverty, the right for her sisters to own absolutely nothing individually or as a community, and to depend entirely on alms and God's providence. This commitment to absolute poverty was so radical that it even made some church authorities uncomfortable. Popes and cardinals tried to persuade Clare to accept some form of regular income or property for her monastery, arguing it was necessary for the nuns' security. But Clare resisted firmly, even respectfully, challenging popes. She fought for decades to have her unique form of life centered on poverty, prayer, silence, and manual labor, officially approved by the Church. She wrote her own rule for her sisters, the first rule for a religious order known to have been written by a woman. It was finally approved by Pope Innocent IV just 2 days before she died. Many stories tell of Clare's deep faith and miraculous powers. One famous account describes how, when Assisi was being attacked by Saracen soldiers in 1240, who were attempting to scale the walls of San Damiano, Clare, though very ill, had herself carried to the monastery wall. She held aloft the Blessed Sacrament in a monstrance, or a pyx. The soldiers were reportedly terrified by the sight and the power emanating from the Eucharist, and they fled. On another occasion, it said that there was only 1 loaf of bread in the monastery for 50 sisters. Clare blessed it, and it miraculously multiplied, so that everyone had enough to eat. Clare spent 42 years at San Damiano, most of them ill and often bedridden, but she continued to lead her community with wisdom and unwavering faith. She died on August 11, 1253. Medieval nuns would have seen in Clare a model of courageous commitment to a chosen spiritual path, a deep love for Christ expressed through poverty, and a woman who was a strong spiritual leader. Number 4. Saint Hildegard of Bingen, the nun who had visions, wrote bestsellers, and told off kings. Hildegard was born in 1098 in Bermersheim, in what is now Germany. She was the 10th child of a noble family. From a very early age, as young as 3, Hildegard began to experience extraordinary visions. She described seeing a brilliant light, which she called the shade of the living light. And within this light, she would receive insights and understanding about religious texts, the natural world, and the workings of the cosmos. She was afraid to speak about these visions for many years, confiding only in her nurse, and later in a monk named Jutta von Sponheim. When Hildegard was 8 years old, her parents dedicated her to the church as a tithe. She was enclosed with Jutta, who was an anchoress, a religious hermit living in a cell attached to a church, at the Benedictine monastery of Dissebodenberg. When Jutta died in 1136, Hildegard, then 38 years old, was unanimously elected as the magistra, or spiritual leader, of the growing community of nuns that had formed around Jutta. It was around this time, at the age of 42, that Hildegard received a powerful visionary command from God. Write down what you see and hear. Though hesitant and feeling unqualified, she often referred to herself as a poor little female. She began to record her visions with the help of her secretary, a monk named Volmar, and her close friend, the nun Richardis van Stade. Her first major visionary work was Civius, an abbreviation of Scito Vias Domini, or Know the Ways of the Lord. It took her 10 years to complete and detailed 26 complex allegorical visions about topics like creation, redemption, and the end of time. The work was illustrated with vibrant images based on her descriptions. When a portion of Scivias was read to Pope Eugenius III at the Synod of Trier in 1147 to 1148, he was deeply impressed and gave her papal approval to continue writing and publishing her visions. This was a huge endorsement and catapulted Hildegard to fame across Europe. Hildegard was not just a mystic. She was a polymath. She wrote theological books, but also works on natural history and medicine, physica, and causae curiae, which showed her keen observations of plants, animals, and the human body, and included many remedies. She composed an astonishing amount of music, over 70 liturgical songs, hymns, and sequences, as well as a morality play called Ordo Virtutum, Order of the Virtues, which is considered one of the earliest examples of liturgical drama. Her music is unique, with soaring melodies and a wide vocal range. She even invented her own alternative alphabet, the lingua ignota, unknown language, along with a vocabulary of over 900 words, perhaps for mystical or artistic purposes. Around 1150, Hildegard decided to move her growing community of nuns from Disibodenberg, where they were part of a male monastery, to a new independent monastery at Rupertsberg, near Bingen, on the Rhine River. This move faced strong opposition from the monks at Disibodenberg, who didn't want to lose the prestige and probably income associated with Hildegard and her nuns. But Hildegard, citing divine instruction, stood her ground and eventually succeeded. Later, she founded a second daughter house at Eibingen. As an abbess, she was a powerful leader and administrator. She also undertook several public preaching tours, speaking to both clergy and laity in cathedrals and public squares, something virtually unheard of for a woman in the 12th century. She corresponded with popes, emperors like Frederick Barbarossa, whom she sharply criticized, kings, and other influential figures, offering them advice, admonitions, and prophecies. She was unafraid to speak truth to power. Towards the end of her life, she faced a major conflict with the ecclesiastical authorities of Mainz. She had allowed an excommunicated nobleman, who had reportedly repented on his deathbed, to be buried in her monastery's cemetery. The authorities demanded she exhume the body. Hildegard refused, stating she had received divine assurance that the man was reconciled with God. As a result, her monastery was placed under interdict, meaning the nuns were forbidden to sing the divine office or receive communion. This was a terrible trial for Hildegard, who loved liturgical music. After several months, the interdict was eventually lifted, not long before her death. Hildegard died on September 17, 1179, at the age of 81. Medieval nuns would have found in Hildegard an incredible model of intellectual achievement, artistic creativity, spiritual depth, and courageous leadership, all sanctioned by divine visions. Number 3. Saint Catherine of Siena, the mystic, who told popes what to do, and they actually listened. Catherine Benincasa was born in Siena, Italy, around 1347, during a tumultuous time marked by plague, political instability, and deep divisions within the Church. She was one of very many children, perhaps the 23rd out of 25. born to Giacomo di Benincasa, a wool dyer, and La Papia Genti. Even as a very young child, Catherine was intensely religious. At the age of 6, she reportedly had her first vision of Christ seated in glory with the apostles Peter, Paul, and John. Around age 7, she made a private vow to dedicate her virginity to God. As she grew into her teens, her parents wanted her to marry. Catherine, however, was determined to live a life focused on prayer and penance. To make herself less attractive to suitors, she cut off her beautiful long hair, a dramatic act of defiance. She also began practicing extreme asceticism, fasting rigorously. For long periods, she reportedly consumed little other than the Eucharist, engaging in long prayer vigils and using instruments of penance. Her family was initially very opposed to her religious intensity, trying to force her into a more conventional life. For a time, they made her do all the household chores to distract her, but she turned this drudgery into a form of spiritual service, imagining her family members as Christ, Mary, and the apostles. Eventually, her father relented, perhaps after witnessing her deep conviction, or as one story goes, seeing a dove hovering over her head while she prayed. At about age 18, Catherine joined the Mantellate, a group of lay Dominican women, tertiaries, in Siena. These women lived in their own homes rather than in a convent, but they wore the Dominican habit and dedicated themselves to prayer and charitable works. For about 3 years, Catherine lived as a virtual recluse in a small room in her parents' house, spending her time in intense prayer and mystical experiences. She described a mystical marriage to Christ, during which she received an invisible ring which only she could see. Around 1370, Catherine felt a divine call to re-enter the world and engage in active service. She began caring for the poor and the sick, especially those with the most repulsive diseases like leprosy or plague, in hospitals and homes. She attracted a group of followers, both men and women, clergy and laity, who were drawn by her holiness, wisdom, and medic personality. They called themselves her Bella Brigata, Dutiful Brigade, or Caterninati. Catherine, though she never learned to write herself, she dictated her letters and works to secretaries, became a prolific letter writer. She wrote hundreds of letters to people from all walks of life: popes, kings, queens, cardinals, soldiers, ordinary citizens, and even condemned prisoners, whom she would comfort in their final hours. Her most famous public actions involved her efforts to bring peace to Italy and to reform the Church. Italy was plagued by warring city-states and factions. Catherine fearlessly inserted herself into political negotiations, urging reconciliation. Even more significantly, she became deeply involved in the crisis of the Avignon papacy. For decades, the popes had resided in Avignon, France, rather than in Rome. Catherine believed passionately that the Pope, as the successor of Saint Peter, belonged in Rome. She traveled to Avignon in 1376 and met with Pope Gregory XI, urging him with incredible boldness and conviction to return the papacy to Rome. Her impassioned pleas, combined with political pressures, are credited with playing a significant role in his decision to finally move back to Rome in 1377. After the Great Schism began in 1378 with 2 and later 3 rival popes claiming legitimacy, Catherine threw her unwavering support behind the Roman Pope, Urban VI. She worked tirelessly, writing letters and dictating her major spiritual work, the Dialogue, or Dialogue of Divine Providence, which records her mystical conversations with God the Father. This work is a masterpiece of spiritual theology. Catherine's health was severely weakened by her extreme asceticism and her tireless labors. She died in Rome on April 29, 1380, at the young age of 33, reportedly offering her life for the unity and reform of the Church. Her body was said to have remained incorrupt for a time, and many miracles were attributed to her intercession. For medieval nuns, Catherine would have been a powerful figure, a mystic who experienced profound union with God, but also a woman of action who is unafraid to speak truth to the highest authorities in the Church and the world, all driven by an intense love for God and for the Church. Number 2. Mary Magdalene, from 7 devils to first witness of the risen Lord. Mary Magdalene is one of the most intriguing and at times debated figures in the New Testament. The Gospels tell us some key things about her. Luke's Gospel 8:2 introduces her as one of the women who had been cured of evil spirits and infirmities specifically. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out. She then became a devoted follower of Jesus, accompanying him and the 12 apostles during his ministry in Galilee. She, along with other women like Joanna and Susanna, supported Jesus and his disciples out of their resources, which suggests she may have been a woman of some means. Her presence becomes especially prominent during the most critical events of Jesus' life, his passion, death, and resurrection. All 4 Gospels place Mary Magdalene at the foot of the cross during Jesus' crucifixion. While many of the male disciples had fled in fear, she remained a steadfast witness to his suffering and death. John's Gospel 19:25 specifically lists her among the small group of women, including Jesus' mother, standing by the cross. After Jesus died, she was there. Mark 15:47 and Matthew 27:61 note that Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, often identified as Mary, the mother of James the Younger and Joseph, were present, sitting opposite the tomb, watching where Jesus' body was laid. But her most significant role, the one that earned her the title Apostle to the Apostles, from early church fathers like Hippolytus of Rome, came on Easter morning. All 4 Gospels again highlight her as one of the very first, if not the first, to discover the empty tomb. John's Gospel 20:1-18 gives the most detailed account of her personal encounter with the risen Christ. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed. She ran to tell Peter and the other disciple whom Jesus loved, traditionally John, that the Lord's body had been taken. Peter and the other disciple ran to the tomb, saw the linen wrappings, and then left. But Mary Magdalene stayed behind, weeping outside the tomb. As she wept, she looked into the tomb and saw 2 angels in white. They asked her why she was crying. She replied, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." Then she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not recognize him. Jesus asked her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus then said to her simply, "Mary." At the sound of her name, spoken by the familiar voice of her teacher, she recognized him and exclaimed, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus then gave her a commission. "Do not hold on to me, because I have not yet ascended to the Father, but go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene then went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord," and she told them what he had said to her. In the Western Church, particularly during the Middle Ages, Mary Magdalene's identity was often conflated with other unnamed women in the Gospels. The anonymous, sinful woman who anointed Jesus' feet with her tears and precious ointment in Luke's Gospel, chapter 7, and Mary of Bethany, the sister of Martha and Lazarus. This combination created the popular image of Mary Magdalene as the repentant prostitute, a beautiful sinner who, after encountering Christ, underwent a profound conversion and became a model of penitence and ardent love for Jesus. Whether or not these identifications were historically accurate, this composite image was incredibly powerful for medieval spirituality. Legends also grew about her life after Christ's ascension. One very popular medieval legend, particularly in France, told that Mary Magdalene, along with Martha, Lazarus, and others, set sail, or were set adrift by persecutors, in a rudderless boat and miraculously landed on the shores of southern Gaul, France. There, she was said to have preached the gospel, and then retired to a cave in the wilderness at Saint-Baume for the last 30 years of her life, living as a hermit in deep contemplation and penance. It was said she was fed no earthly food, but was lifted up by angels 7 times a day to hear the choirs of heaven. This image of the contemplative hermit, consumed by love for God, was profoundly inspiring. For medieval nuns, Mary Magdalene represented the power of repentance, the depth of contemplative love, the courage of discipleship, and the immense privilege of being the first chosen witness to the resurrection, a herald of the good news. Number 1. The Virgin Mary, the teenager who said yes and became Queen of Heaven. Mary, the mother of Jesus Christ, holds a unique and preeminent place among saints for all Christians, and her significance for medieval nuns was immeasurable. Her story, primarily found in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, begins in Nazareth, a small town in Galilee. She was a young Jewish woman betrothed, a binding legal commitment similar to marriage, to a carpenter named Joseph, a descendant of King David. The pivotal moment in her life, and indeed in Christian history, is the Annunciation, described in Luke's Gospel, 1:26-38. The angel Gabriel appeared to Mary and greeted her with the words, "Greetings, favored one, the Lord is with you." Mary was understandably perplexed and troubled by this greeting. The angel then told her not to be afraid, for she had found favor with God. He announced that she would conceive in her womb and bear a son, and she was to name him Jesus. He would be great and would be called the Son of the Most High, and the Lord God would give him the throne of his ancestor David. He would reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there would be no end. "Mary, a virgin?" asked the angel. "How can this be, since I am a virgin?" The angel explained that the Holy Spirit would come upon her, and the power of the Most High would overshadow her. Therefore, the child to be born would be holy, and would be called Son of God. The angel also told her about her relative Elizabeth, who in her old age had also conceived a son. For nothing will be impossible with God. Mary's response to this overwhelming and unprecedented announcement was one of profound faith and obedience. "Here am I, the servant of the Lord. Let it be with me according to your word." This fiat, her "let it be," was seen as the moment human free will cooperated perfectly with God's divine plan. Following the Annunciation, Mary went to visit her cousin Elizabeth, who was pregnant with John the Baptist. This event is known as the Visitation. Luke chapter 1 verse 39-56. Upon Mary's greeting, the infant John leaped in Elizabeth's womb, and Elizabeth, filled with the Holy Spirit, exclaimed, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb." Mary responded with her beautiful hymn of praise, the Magnificat, "My soul magnifies the Lord," which expresses her joy, humility, and recognition of God's mercy and power. Medieval nuns would have recited the Magnificat daily as part of their Vespers prayers. And the finding of the young Jesus in the temple in Jerusalem after he had been missing for 3 days. Luke chapter 2 verse 41-52. Throughout these early years, Luke notes that Mary treasured all these words and pondered them in her heart, presenting her as a model of quiet contemplation and reflection. During Jesus' public ministry, Mary appears at certain points, such as the wedding at Cana, John chapter 2 verse 111, where, at her subtle prompting, Jesus performed his first miracle, changing water into wine. This highlighted her compassionate awareness of others' needs and her influential intercession with her Son. Most profoundly, she stood faithfully at the foot of the cross during Jesus' crucifixion. John chapter 19 verse 25-27. There, Jesus entrusted her to the care of the disciple John, and John to her, making her, in a spiritual sense, the mother of all believers. After Jesus' ascension, Mary was present with the apostles in the upper room in Jerusalem, devoting themselves to prayer, awaiting the coming of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost, Acts chapter 1 verse 14. While the Bible doesn't describe the end of Mary's earthly life, strong ancient tradition, particularly in the Eastern and Western churches, holds that she was assumed body and soul into heavenly glory. This belief in the Assumption became a significant feast. Medieval devotion to Mary was incredibly rich and varied. She was seen as the ideal of purity, humility, obedience, and maternal love. For nuns who had vowed virginity or chastity, Mary was the ultimate model of a consecrated life. She was the Queen of Heaven, the Mother of God, Theotokos, the star of the sea, Stella Maris, guiding them through life's storms, and a powerful intercessor who could obtain graces and protection from her Son. Nuns dedicated their chapels, their prayers, and their very lives to her, seeking her guidance and imitating her virtues. Countless stories, hymns, and artworks celebrated her life and her compassionate care for humanity. She was not just a saint to be admired, but a mother to be loved and trusted.